A Boston University geologist stood in front of the Great Sphinx, ran his hands across its stone, and said something that should have rewritten history. This monument was carved by rain. Not sand, not wind. Rain, in a part of the world that hasn't seen serious rainfall in over 5,000 years. If he's right, the Sphinx isn't Egyptian at all. It's older than Egypt itself. Egypt's own government has spent over 30 years making sure nobody gets close enough to prove it either way. Here's the claim, and here's exactly why it refuses to die. Every wind-eroded structure at Giza, the pyramids, the Old Kingdom tombs, everything conventional Egyptology confidently dates to around 2500 BC, shows the exact same signature. Horizontal striations, smooth layered bands cut by thousands of years of blowing sand riding along soft rock strata. That's the fingerprint of desert erosion, and it's all over Giza, consistent and predictable on every structure Egyptologists agree is genuinely Old Kingdom in age. The Sphinx doesn't have that fingerprint. It has vertical channels, deep, rounded, undulating grooves running down its body, and enclosure walls, the specific unmistakable pattern water leaves behind when it runs downhill in sheets over and over for centuries, carving smooth channels the way a flash flood carves a canyon wall rather than the way a sandstorm sweeps a dune. Not sand, water. And it isn't confined to the statue itself. The same vertical weathering pattern shows up on the walls of the Sphinx's own enclosure, the pit carved into the bedrock surrounding it, a detail proponents argue rules out localized damage from a single unusual storm and points instead toward a sustained ancient climate pattern. That distinction is what brought geologist Dr. Robert Schoch to Giza in 1990 at the invitation of researcher John Anthony West. Schoch had a PhD in geology and geophysics from Yale, a faculty position at Boston University, and, by his own account, no particular interest in ancient aliens or lost continents when he arrived. He specialized in rock weathering. That was the entire qualification West needed. Schoch says it took him seconds, not years, to reach his conclusion once he was standing in front of the stone. The weathering pattern on the Sphinx's body and surrounding enclosure walls was, in his professional geological opinion, consistent with prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall and runoff. Not wind, not sand, not 5,000 years of desert climate. For that kind of sustained precipitation to have carved those channels, the Sphinx would need to have been standing exposed to the elements during a dramatically wetter period in North African history, pushing its true age back to somewhere between 7,000 and 5,000 BC, potentially even earlier. That's not a small revision. That's doubling the monument's age and placing its construction before Egyptian civilization, as mainstream archaeology defines it, is even supposed to have existed. Development number 2. Schoch didn't publish this quietly. In 1991, he presented the finding formally to the Geological Society of America, a serious credentialed scientific body, not a fringe conference. The room didn't laugh him out. Geologists who reviewed his methodology largely found the erosion analysis itself sound. The backlash came from somewhere else entirely. It came from Egyptology. Dr. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's former Minister of Antiquities, and for decades the single most powerful gatekeeper controlling access to Giza, rejected the redating outright, and he didn't stop at a polite academic disagreement. Hawass co-authored a formal joint response with Egyptologist Mark Lenner in 1994, directly rebutting Schoch's hypothesis, and has argued for years that Schoch's geology, whatever its merits as rock science, ignores the actual archaeological context. No independent predynastic settlement, tool assemblage, or cultural evidence from a hypothetical 7,000 BC civilization has ever been found anywhere near Giza. No pottery, no graves, no trace of the actual people who supposedly carved a 240-foot monument out of solid limestone thousands of years before agriculture, writing, or settled civilization is otherwise documented to have existed in Egypt at all. Hawas's argument carries real institutional weight. He's built decades of Egyptological authority specifically on defending the conventional chronology, and every credential, every position, every headline he's earned has come from being right about that timeline in the eyes of the field he's dominated. That's the core of the counter-argument, and it's a real one, not a dismissal. A water-eroded rock face proves water once ran across that rock face. It does not, by itself, prove who carved the shape beneath the erosion or when. Advocates for an older Sphinx have countered that the erosion pattern only makes sense if the carving itself predates the rain that shaped it, meaning the civilization capable of quarrying and shaping that much stone would have to predate the erosion too, whether or not their settlements have survived for archaeologists to find. West and Schoch have also pointed out that the head of the Sphinx appears disproportionately small relative to its body and shows far less water erosion than the body beneath it, a discrepancy they argue is best explained by a later dynasty recarving an already ancient, badly weathered head into a recognizable royal likeness, effectively remodeling a pre-existing monument rather than building it from scratch. Here's development 3, and it's the one that turns this from an academic dispute into something with real institutional teeth. For years, researchers aligned with the older Sphinx theory have reported unusual difficulty securing permits for follow-up geological survey work at Giza, core sampling, deeper enclosure wall analysis, anything that might independently date the erosion with more precision than a visual assessment. Access to Egypt's most scrutinized monument, sitting at the center of one of the largest tourism economies on the planet, runs entirely through the same antiquities authority that has publicly and repeatedly rejected the water erosion theory since it was first proposed. Believers call that a closed loop by design. Egyptian officials call it standard, necessary protection for an irreplaceable national monument that gets more unqualified interference from outside researchers than virtually any other archaeological site on Earth. Both things can be true. That tension, a real scientific dispute sitting on top of a real single point of institutional control over who gets to test it further, is exactly why this theory has survived over 3 decades of mainstream rejection without ever fully going away. Now here's where the story widens, because the Sphinx isn't standing alone anymore. In 2010, archaeologists working roughly 600 miles north of Giza in southeastern Turkey uncovered something that changed the baseline for what too old to be possible even means. Göbekli Tepe, a complex of massive, deliberately carved stone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, some standing over 16 feet tall and weighing many tons, decorated with detailed relief carvings of animals, radiocarbon dated with high confidence to around 9,600 BC, roughly 6,000 years older than the pyramids, predating Stonehenge by 6 millennia, predating the invention of pottery, agriculture, and writing entirely. Mainstream archaeology accepted Göbekli Tepe immediately and without the decades of resistance the Sphinx theory has faced, for one simple reason. It came with undeniable, directly datable organic material at the site itself: charcoal, plant remains, bone, buried in sealed layers, rather than a contested reading of a rock face hundreds of miles away with no comparable material to test. But Göbekli Tepe matters enormously to the Sphinx debate, whether mainstream Egyptology likes the comparison or not. It proves conclusively, with no room for dispute, that organized human societies capable of quarrying, transporting, and precisely arranging multi-ton stone monuments already existed thousands of years before the conventional start of Egyptian civilization. Built by all all available evidence by hunter-gatherer communities who hadn't even developed agriculture yet, upending decades of assumptions about what pre-farming societies were capable of organizing. The exact objection Hawass raises against an older Sphinx, that no society capable of that kind of construction is known to have existed in that era, has already been disproven just a few thousand miles away at a completely different site nobody disputes. If Göbekli Tepe's builders could do it in 9600 BC using nothing but stone tools and coordinated labor, the "nobody could have built it that early" argument against the Sphinx gets considerably harder to make with total confidence. Development 4, and this is where it stops being just about old stone and starts being about what's still sealed underneath it. In 2017, an international team using muon tomography, detectors that track naturally occurring cosmic particles passing through solid rock, the same physics used to find hidden density variations inside mountains and volcanoes, identified a previously unknown massive void deep inside the Great Pyramid of Giza. Real, peer-reviewed, published in the journal Nature, independently confirmed using 3 separate detection methods by 3 separate research teams working without knowledge of each other's results in advance, a level of cross-verification that most archaeological claims never come close to receiving. A hidden chamber over 30 meters long, sitting inside history's most thoroughly studied building that literally nobody on Earth knew existed until physics found it 4,500 years after the pyramid was completed. Its purpose, to this day, remains completely undetermined. Egyptian authorities have permitted continued muon scanning to refine the chamber's shape and location, but have not authorized any physical excavation or endoscopic camera access into the void itself years after its discovery. To skeptics, that's simply appropriate caution around a fragile 4,000-year-old monument holding up millions of tons of stone, where a single miscalculated drilling attempt could risk structural damage to an irreplaceable World Heritage Site. To believers in an older, pre-dynastic layer of Egyptian history, it's the single most tantalizing unopened door in the entire field. A confirmed, government-acknowledged hidden space inside the most famous building on Earth, sitting unexplored years after its discovery was already front-page news around the world, with no public timeline for when or if anyone will ever actually look inside. Layer that on top of the Osiris shaft, a real, multi-level vertical shaft beneath the Giza Plateau, descending roughly 30 meters through solid bedrock, discovered decades ago, containing a water-filled lower chamber and a massive granite sarcophagus so heavy and so precisely fitted that early explorers assumed it had to be Old Kingdom in origin, only for later reassessment to leave its actual age and purpose more ambiguous than initially assumed, with some researchers noting the shaft's construction style doesn't cleanly match typical 4th Dynasty engineering elsewhere on the plateau. The shaft remained officially closed to general public access for years, opening only recently on a limited basis. Another real example of a genuinely mysterious underground feature at Giza that sat functionally sealed from independent scrutiny for far longer than the general public ever knew it existed, buried in plain sight beneath one of the most photographed tourist sites on the planet. And then there's the prophecy that arguably started the entire modern obsession in the first place. Decades before Schoch ever set foot in Egypt, the American psychic Edgar Cayce made a specific prediction during a series of 1930s and 40s trance readings that a lost civilization called Atlantis had been destroyed around 10,500 BC, that its survivors fled to Egypt and brought advanced knowledge with them, and that a secret hall of records documenting that civilization's true history remained sealed somewhere beneath the Sphinx's scientists pause, waiting to be discovered before the end of the 20th century. Casey's prediction has never been fulfilled. No Hall of Records has ever been found. Mainstream science treats the prophecy as exactly what it appears to be, an unverified psychic claim with zero archaeological standing. But it's worth knowing that Casey's reading is the actual origin point that sent John Anthony West looking for a geologist in the first place, meaning the entire modern water erosion controversy, real scientific data and all, traces its roots directly back to an unproven 1930s psychic prophecy, whether its supporters emphasize that lineage or not. So here's where the evidence actually leaves you, laid out plainly. A credentialed Yale-trained geologist examined the Sphinx's erosion pattern and concluded, using standard rock weathering science accepted at a formal Geological Society presentation, that it points to a construction date thousands of years earlier than mainstream Egyptology accepts. Egypt's own Antiquities Authority has rejected that conclusion for over 3 decades, citing a genuine, legitimate absence of corroborating archaeological evidence, while also controlling every single permit required to gather more of it. A confirmed, real, physics-verified hidden chamber sits unexplored inside the Great Pyramid to this day, years after making international headlines. A separate, genuinely mysterious granite-lined shaft sat closed to the public for decades before anyone outside a small circle of researchers even knew to ask about it. And the entire modern controversy traces back to a 1930s psychic prophecy that has technically already failed to come true on the exact timeline its own believer originally set for it. Was the Sphinx really carved by a civilization history has completely forgotten, standing exposed to the rain thousands of years before the first pharaoh was ever crowned? The same way Göbekli Tepe sat forgotten and undocumented for 11,000 years before anyone thought to dig there? Or is this simply what happens when one geologist's honest reading of a rock face collides with an institution that has spent a century building its entire authority on a timeline it can't afford to be wrong about, and just so happens to control the only door left standing between the public and the answer?